The city carried a weight that seemed older than the war itself, a muted grayness that clung to buildings, bridges, and the long, narrow streets like an extra layer of ash. London did not announce the arrival of the Americans with fanfare. It absorbed them first, as it had absorbed so many shocks before, allowing the sound of engines and boots to blend into the familiar backdrop of distant sirens, church bells, and the restless hum of a population that had grown accustomed to vigilance. Morning light filtered through a low ceiling of clouds, catching on broken roof lines and the scaffolding that marked yet another attempt to repair what had already been shattered once, perhaps twice. Shopkeepers paused in their routines. Women carrying ration bags slowed their pace. Children, too young to understand the full implications of uniforms and insignia, found their eyes drawn to the movement gathering at the edges of the main thoroughfares. The American convoys approached not with the practiced austerity of a seasoned garrison, but with an energy that felt almost foreign to the city's battered restraint. Trucks rolled forward in measured columns, their sides marked with stenciled numbers, their surfaces streaked by salt, dust, and the residue of transit. Men sat upright in the back, shoulders squared beneath heavy wool coats, rifles slung with deliberate neatness, expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and solemn anticipation. Those stepping down from the transports moved with a quiet assurance, trying not to betray the unease of entering a place that had already endured years of bombardment. They looked up more often than they expected to, noting the hollowed windows, the exposed brick, the absence of rooftops where rooftops clearly should have been. It was not the kind of battlefield they had trained for, yet it carried the unmistakable presence of war. Along the pavements, the British civilians watched with a mixture of reserved acknowledgement and unspoken calculations. Their eyes measured not merely the number of men, but the scale of material, the crates, the communications equipment, the orderly stacks of supplies moving towards staging areas that had been mapped out weeks in advance. A quiet understanding passed among them that this was not a parade arranged for morale. It was preparation, layered with intent. For the Americans, the streets served as corridors of orientation, forcing them to match their cadence to the contours of a city that required patience rather than spectacle. Officers moved among their units, adjusting formations, checking details, ensuring that every movement suggested discipline without aggression, presence without intrusion. Weather lent its own commentary. A faint drizzle began to settle, flattening reflections into the slick surfaces of the roads, softening the sharpness of sound. Boots struck the wet pavement with a rhythm that seemed almost ceremonial in its restraint. The air carried the faint scent of coal smoke and damp stone, mingled with the metallic tang from nearby rail yards. Somewhere a radio crackled behind a second-floor window, a voice obscured by static, reporting developments that no one could ignore yet no one felt compelled to discuss aloud. The moment did not feel celebratory. It felt transitional, as if the city itself recognized the significance of new actors stepping onto a stage long prepared for them. For the troops, the march would serve as an initiation into the psychological landscape of the conflict they had crossed an ocean to join. They became aware, step by careful step, that they were walking through a living testimony to endurance. Every boarded doorway and sandbagged entrance suggested choices made under pressure, nights spent in darkness, days measured by the proximity of danger. The men kept their gaze level, resisting the impulse to stare too long at the scars etched into masonry and memory alike. In their silence, There was a tacit acknowledgement that they were now participants in a struggle already paid for in advance by others. As the columns formed more tightly near the designated routes, the sound grew steadier, the lines straighter, the sense of choreography clearer. There was no overt invitation to cheer, and few attempted it. Instead, the city offered a restrained nod, a collective recognition that the arrival of these troops represented not an end, but a deepening of commitment. The Americans adjusted their pace once more, aligning themselves with the rhythm of London, preparing to carry forward under watchful eyes that understood, perhaps better than they did, the cost of what awaited beyond the horizon. In the days leading toward the march, Churchill regarded the approaching event not as a spectacle to be admired, but as a moment to be weighed with the seriousness of a statesman who understood that symbols, when seen by millions, could shape the psychology of war as powerfully as any directive issued from a cabinet room. He had followed every report concerning the American buildup with rigorous attention, reading dispatches late into the night, marking passages that spoke to capacity, temperament, and resolve. His expectations were not purely operational. He wanted to observe, with his own eyes, what kind of force had crossed the Atlantic to stand alongside Britain at a time when endurance had become a daily discipline rather than a strategy. He wondered whether the youthfulness so often attributed to the Americans would translate into vigor or impatience, whether their confidence might prove to be an advantage, or whether it would require careful containment within the realities Europe already knew too well. The Prime Minister moved through his schedule with the practiced control of a man accustomed to balancing ceremonial obligation with the pressure of looming decisions. He did not romanticize what was coming. He viewed the parade as an instrument, a test of cohesion and maturity, an opportunity to read in posture, step, and comportment the intangible qualities that no intelligence summary could adequately capture. He recalled earlier alliances, earlier promises, the long history of great powers arriving on foreign shores with ambition and uncertainty in equal measure. In private, his thoughts carried the habitual gravity of someone who had seen empires stumble when they misread either themselves or their partners. The Americans, he believed, had brought with them enormous industrial strength and an almost instinctive belief in eventual victory. What he needed to discern was how that belief would behave under the weight of European warfare, and how it might integrate with a British society conditioned by endurance rather than sudden momentum. As preparations were laid out before him by aides and military advisers, Churchill listened less for reassurance than for nuance. He asked questions about command relationships, logistical frameworks, and the temperament of officers who would be present. He considered how the British public would perceive the display, not simply as a reassurance of camaraderie, but as a tangible reminder that the conflict had widened and that Britain was no longer bearing its burdens alone. Yet he also knew that partnership invited comparison, and comparison could invite doubt. If the Americans appeared too exuberant, it might seem as though they misunderstood the gravity of the struggle. If they appeared too rigid, they might seem detached from the human strain the city embodied. He expected and quietly hoped for a balance, disciplined movement that conveyed strength, accompanied by a demeanor that recognized the solemnity of standing in a capital scarred by persistent threat. On the morning itself, before he took his place, Churchill allowed himself a moment of reflective distance. He thought of the long chain of decisions that had led to this convergence, the diplomatic negotiations, the coordination of shipping lanes, the sacrifices of merchant crews, the relentless planning by staffs on both sides of the ocean. He understood that what London would witness was not merely the presence of men in uniform, but the visible manifestation of a strategic alignment whose consequences would extend far beyond any single day. He also recognized his own role within that scene. His expressions, gestures, and even the subtle inflections of his body language would be read by observers at home and abroad. He would need to project steadiness, neither celebratory nor indifferent, acknowledging the moment without allowing it to distort the sober realities still ahead. Inwardly, his expectations settled into a kind of disciplined curiosity. He anticipated precision, order, and the unmistakable confidence that characterized American military culture. But beneath that, he looked for signs of introspection, the quiet understanding that wars are not won by presence alone, and that alliance requires humility as much as strength. For Churchill, the parade would not answer every question, yet it would provide vital impressions. It would reveal how these new partners carried themselves within a city that had paid dearly for survival, and whether their bearing suggested an appreciation of the gravity they were about to share. As he prepared to observe, he did so not as a spectator seeking reassurance, but as a leader measuring alignment, silently calculating what might be demanded of all of them in the long, uncertain months to come. When the first ranks came into view, Churchill did not immediately speak. He allowed the scene to gather around him, to register in its full, unhurried detail before any judgment formed. The Americans advanced along the wet avenue in long, disciplined lines, boots striking the pavement with a subdued cadence that seemed almost respectful of the city they were entering. Their uniforms, still bearing traces of travel, caught the pale light in muted tones, while the flags and guidons moved with restrained precision rather than flourish. From his vantage point, the Prime Minister studied the faces that passed, serious, intent, marked by a concentration that suggested both determination and the quiet effort of mastering one's own doubts. He observed their posture, the settled way their shoulders carried the weight of gear, the steady hands that held rifles at the exact angle prescribed by drill. Nothing here resembled theatrical display. The power lay in the constancy of the movement, the collective impression that this was a force accustomed to order and willing to submit itself to the demands of something larger than any single man. He found himself attentive to small details. The way an officer's brief glance guided an entire company back into perfect alignment, the subtle adjustments made by non-commissioned leaders as they shepherded the column through narrow turns. The rhythm remained firm even when the cobblestones grew uneven or the street constricted near damaged buildings. Churchill recognized the discipline not as a rigid artifact of training, but as an expression of mindset, an indication that the Americans understood they were being measured not just for martial competence, but for their capacity to bear responsibility. The city, scarred and observant, received them without theatrical applause. Instead, there was a muted, almost contemplative silence, as though London itself was taking the same measure he was taking, quietly assessing whether this new presence could be trusted to stand the long test that lay ahead. As more units passed, the Prime Minister shifted slightly, leaning forward with the intentness of a man accustomed to reading character through movement. He noticed that the men did not scan the crowd for admiration. They kept their gaze level, focused, respectful. There was confidence here, but not swagger. Even the younger soldiers, whose faces still carried traces of youth, held themselves with a seriousness that implied awareness of the gravity they now belonged to. Churchill sensed an emerging convergence between two cultures, British endurance, shaped by years of attrition, and American resolve, shaped by a belief in purposeful momentum. He watched for any hint of impatience or casualness and saw instead an almost studied composure, as if these men understood that this march was not rehearsal but declaration. The sound of the column, boots, webbing, muted commands, rose and fell like a measured tide. Vehicles rolled behind the marching troops with deliberate spacing, engines idling at disciplined intervals. To Churchill, the logistics were as revealing as the soldiers themselves. He noted the neat arrangement of equipment, the guarded efficiency with which drivers guided heavy transports through constricted streets, the absence of unnecessary motion. War had taught him that true strength often revealed itself in the quiet reliability of practical details, and here those details spoke with clarity. The Americans were not simply present, they were organized, prepared, conscious of the stage upon which they now moved. For a moment his attention returned to the city around him, the damaged facades, the angled sandbags, the windows where silhouettes watched in silence. Against this backdrop, the American column acquired a different kind of significance. It was not merely an Allies' army, it was a statement of continuity, a signal that the burden would now be shared in more than words. Churchill's expression remained restrained, but internally he noted a subtle shift. The doubts he carried did not disappear, yet they encountered new counterweights, evidence of discipline, of seriousness, of a developing maturity within a force that had traveled far to be judged here. As the march continued past his position, he followed it with a steady gaze, allowing each impression to settle rather than rush toward optimism or skepticism. He understood that the deeper tests would come later, on terrains far removed from this measured procession. But in this moment, watching these men thread themselves through a wounded capital with deliberate calm, he recognized something essential, a readiness shaped not by rhetoric, but by composure, restraint, and the quiet willingness to be seen exactly as they were. For a long moment he remained silent. Then, almost as if speaking to the air rather than to the cluster of aides around him, Churchill allowed his words to emerge with the slow cadence of someone measuring their meaning as carefully as their sound. He remarked that the sight before him carried a remarkable composure, and that these men conveyed strength without the theatrics that often betrayed inexperience. He added that war, when it ceased to be romantic, demanded this precise form of steadiness, and he noted in a low voice that confidence worn quietly was far more dependable than any display of exuberance. Turning slightly, he observed to a senior officer that what impressed him was not the mass itself, but the discipline within the mass, the way each soldier seemed to understand his part in a structure larger than his own ambitions. He said that if this attitude held, there is much that can be built upon, and he spoke of the responsibility Britain now shared with an ally whose resolve appeared not merely proclaimed, but inhabited. When one of his aides attempted to compliment the American turnout, Churchill gently redirected the praise, saying it would be wise to study them carefully, because the test of alliance was not how it looked in ceremonial moments, but how it behaved under prolonged strain. He remarked, almost in confidence, that the Americans seemed to have arrived without illusions about what lay ahead, and he stressed that this sobriety was more reassuring than any rhetorical assurance ever could be. He commented on the absence of swagger, calling it a sign of seriousness that bodes well, and he added that armies which carried themselves with humility generally learned faster, adapted more intelligently, and endured longer. The Prime Minister then allowed himself a rare, quiet admission. that it was heartening to see the burden of Britain's ordeal no longer resting on British shoulders alone. But he warned those beside him that the presence of allies also demanded greater discipline of leadership, because cooperation magnified both strengths and mistakes. He spoke of the importance of mutual respect, noting that partnerships only thrive when both sides understand the cost being borne by the other. As more companies passed, he leaned slightly forward and said, almost reflectively, that London would judge these men not by how they walked today, but by what they were willing to suffer for in the months ahead. Responding to a whispered observation that the march was impressive, Churchill replied that impressive matters less than reliable, and he emphasized that reliability, once earned, became a strategic asset in itself. He remarked that the Americans displayed an earnestness that suggested they were ready to learn from the hard lessons Britain had already absorbed. He noted their restraint, remarking that restraint was not weakness but an advanced form of discipline, the kind possessed by forces conscious of their own power and unwilling to waste it. When the column paused briefly to correct spacing, he pointed to the calm precision with which officers restored order and said, with quiet approval, that such habits under pressure were the true indicators of military character. He concluded by saying in measured tones that what he had witnessed gave him a guarded confidence, and he cautioned those listening never to confuse guarded confidence with complacency. For him, the moment required neither rhetoric nor applause. It required acknowledgment, spoken plainly in front of those who needed to hear it, that these men had arrived not as guests, but as partners in a struggle from which there would be no easy withdrawal, and that their bearing suggested they understood the gravity of the role they had come to assume. The words had scarcely settled into the cool air before those standing nearest to Churchill absorbed them with a stillness that felt almost reverential. The senior officers beside him exchanged brief, measured looks, as if quietly recalibrating their own impressions in light of his assessment. No one rushed to agree, and no one attempted to embellish what he had said. Instead, they seemed to recognize that his reflections carried an implicit directive: observe carefully, interpret cautiously, and resist the temptation to draw comforting conclusions too quickly. An aide, pen hovering over his notebook, hesitated for a moment, aware that these comments were not mere ceremony but a form of strategic guidance, spoken aloud so that the implications might be understood as much as recorded. He wrote slowly, ensuring that tone and substance were preserved with fidelity. Around them, the atmosphere shifted into something quieter, though not diminished. The observers closest to the Prime Minister began to watch the marching troops with a renewed intentionality, as if invited to see beyond the surface of uniforms and precision. A British general, hands clasped behind his back, nodded almost imperceptibly, his expression reflecting a certain sober agreement. Another officer, younger and less seasoned, seemed at once encouraged and sobered by Churchill's restraint. The absence of outright praise reminded him that strength could be acknowledged without being romanticized, and that leadership required the discipline to balance hope with realism. They stood slightly straighter, their attention deepening, not in pageantry but in analysis. In the wider crowd, word of Churchill's demeanor passed indirectly rather than through explicit repetition. People sensed the measured gravity in his posture, the deliberate calm with which he regarded the procession. Civilians who had gathered nearby continued to watch in silence, feeling the weight of the moment settle over them like the low, persistent cloud cover overhead. A woman holding the hand of a child tightened her grip slightly, not in fear, but in recognition that something consequential was unfolding in front of them, something that connected private endurance to the broader machinery of war. The men and women who had come to see, to witness, found themselves adopting the same composure Churchill projected, resisting applause, resisting the impulse to treat the march as spectacle. The American officers who could see him from a distance registered his presence without any outward change in bearing. Yet, for some, the awareness carried an added sense of responsibility. They marched not simply past a foreign leader, but past a figure whose nation had withstood years of relentless pressure. The moment seemed to impose its own discipline. Voices lowered. Movements grew more economical. Even the sound of engines became part of a larger, subdued rhythm that filled the streets with steady, unhurried power. In that restrained cadence, the city breathed, as though adjusting itself to accommodate the new weight of shared purpose. Those around Churchill continued to stand without unnecessary motion, attentive to details in the way one listens for subtle shifts in weather. A political advisor leaned slightly forward, absorbing the implications of Churchill's remarks. Guarded confidence, insistence on reliability, insistence on humility. He understood that these were not casual observations but a framework for thinking about the alliance itself. A military secretary, having written down the key phrasing, glanced briefly toward the troops with an expression that conveyed both caution and respect. None of them attempted to extend the conversation. They sensed that more words would only dilute the clarity of what had already been said. The atmosphere that followed became almost contemplative. The city's ordinary sounds receded. What remained was the cadence of boots, the rustle of coats, the muted echo of orders spoken just loud enough to be heard by those who needed to hear them. Above the street, figures leaned from damaged windows, their faces still, their attention fully captured. They did not cheer. They simply watched, as if committing the moment to memory for reasons they could not yet articulate. The presence of the Americans felt less like a rival and more like confirmation, evidence that the struggle had grown beyond the island's edges, that reinforcements now belonged not to rumor, but to reality. Within this subdued atmosphere, Churchill's words lingered not as rhetoric but as a quiet standard against which impressions would now be measured. Those in his immediate circle carried them inward, reflecting on the responsibilities implied rather than the reassurance offered. The march continued, disciplined and exacting, and the air held a sense of gravity that was neither despairing nor triumphant. It was the gravity of people who understood that history was shifting, and that even in its most solemn moments, it demanded attentiveness, restraint, and the willingness to interpret significance carefully rather than seize upon it too quickly. As the final elements of the column receded into the distance, the impression left behind did not dissolve with the sound of their footsteps. Instead, it settled into the minds of those who had watched, altering the quiet arithmetic by which they measured the alliance itself. What had previously existed as agreements, communiques, and strategic language now possessed a tangible form, visible and audible, moving with intent through a city that had endured the worst and continued to stand. For many British observers, the alliance ceased to be an abstraction and became a lived reality, defined not merely by promises but by presence. The sight of American soldiers moving with disciplined restraint through London reframed expectations, suggesting that cooperation would not be a temporary arrangement born of necessity, but a sustained partnership built upon shared burdens and mutual accountability. There was an emerging recognition that both nations were now bound together not only in policy, but in consequence, and that this shared trajectory would shape decisions with a new degree of gravity. Among political figures and military planners, perceptions began to shift in subtler ways. They saw in the Americans not simply an infusion of manpower and material, but an evolving maturity, a willingness to adapt to the somber cadence of a war already deep into its most exacting stages. The alliance no longer appeared as a pairing of exhausted endurance with untouched potential. It looked increasingly like the gradual alignment of two strategic cultures learning to think, move, and bear responsibility together. Where earlier there had been questions about readiness, temperament, and the ability to operate under unrelenting pressure, there now existed a more measured confidence, tempered by the understanding that confidence alone was insufficient. The moment imposed an intellectual realism. Strength must be harmonized, expectations must be synchronized, and leadership must take care not to assume that shared objectives automatically guaranteed shared understanding. For civilians, the road ahead seemed at once more daunting and more comprehensible. They sensed that the conflict was growing in scale, that the horizon no longer belonged solely to Britain, and that the presence of American troops indicated both promise and complexity. The relief that came from knowing they were no longer isolated mingled with an awareness that deeper commitments would follow. The alliance, as reflected in this quiet march, implied coordination on an unprecedented level, requiring patience, discipline, and the capacity to accept that victory, if it came, would emerge from cumulative effort rather than sudden transformation. In that recognition lay a sobering comfort. The struggle had expanded, and with it, responsibility had widened to include new actors who appeared ready to assume their share. For Churchill, and for those who watched beside him, the scene served as a lens through which the future could be viewed with greater clarity. The alliance would demand trust that had to be earned repeatedly, respect maintained deliberately, and decisions made with sensitivity to the sacrifices already rendered by each partner. The march suggested that the Americans understood this, or were at least learning to. It showed that their presence was not simply reinforcement, but a statement of intent anchored in discipline, humility, and growing awareness. In this light, the path forward appeared neither easier nor shorter, but more coherent. The coalition was becoming something more than diplomatic alignment. It was evolving into a shared psychological posture toward the war itself. As the streets gradually returned to their ordinary rhythms, the memory of the moment lingered with an understated persistence. It did not invite celebration. It invited reflection. Observers walked away with the sense that history had shifted not through a dramatic declaration, but through a measured demonstration of readiness and resolve. The alliance, newly reframed, now carried with it a deeper sense of inevitability and responsibility, suggesting that whatever lay ahead would be faced not in isolation, but in deliberate concert, guided by leaders and soldiers alike who had begun to understand the weight of what they were undertaking together.